The great mounds stood silent against the morning mist when the young woman first smelled the wrongness in the air. 3 suns had passed since traders from the southern valleys had brought word of the river people's strange silence, and now, as she crested the final hill overlooking their ancient settlement, the truth struck her like a war club to the chest. Where 10,000 voices once rose with the dawn prayers, only wind whispered through abandoned lodge poles. The settlement stretched below like the skeleton of some massive beast, its earthen mounds rising from the valley floor like sleeping giants. But something was terribly wrong. No smoke curled from cooking fires, no children splashed in the shallows where the great river bent toward the eastern forests. The massive central mound, taller than 50 warriors standing upon each other's shoulders, cast its shadow over empty plazas where thousands once gathered for the harvest ceremonies. The young woman's hunting party of 7 had traveled 12 suns from their home villages when the crow omens began. First, the blackbirds had circled their camp 3 times at dawn, calling in voices that sounded almost human. Then the elk they tracked had turned south instead of following the river, as if fleeing something unseen. Her grandfather, the elder, keeper of the old memories, had warned her that when the crow spirits spoke in daylight, the earth itself was weeping. The river people had ruled these valleys for longer than memory stretched. Their traders carried shells from the great waters to the frozen northern lakes, bringing back copper that gleamed like captured sunlight and obsidian sharper than winter wind. Their mound builders had raised monuments that would outlast the oldest trees, placing the bones of their chiefs in chambers deep within the earth. Yet now, as the young woman descended toward the settlement's edge, she saw only abandonment where prosperity once flourished. Moving through the outer lodges, her hunters found signs of hasty departure everywhere. Grinding stones lay beside half-finished cornmeal. Clay pots sat cooling near dead fires, some still holding the remnants of morning stew. Blankets woven from buffalo wool lay tangled as if their owners had risen suddenly in the night, never to return. Yet there were no signs of violence, no broken weapons or blood-stained earth. The tracker, her most skilled tracker, examined the pathways between lodges with growing confusion. "The footprints tell stories that make no sense," he whispered, his weathered face creasing with worry. Here, a woman carried her child toward the river. There, an elder walked slowly toward the great mound. But the tracks, they fade before reaching their destinations, as if the people simply vanished into the morning mist. The river people's sacred plaza stretched before them like a vast bowl carved from the earth itself. 4 smaller mounds marked the directions of the 4 winds, while the great central mound dominated the sky. Carved poles, still standing in their ceremonial circles, bore the images of the thunderbird, the underwater panther, and the horned serpent. But the silence pressed against them like a living thing, broken only by the distant cry of water birds and the whisper of wind through empty doorways. The young woman's youngest hunter, suddenly grabbed her arm. "Listen," he breathed. "Do you hear that?" From somewhere deep within the settlement came a sound barely audible above the wind. It was rhythmic, like distant drumming, but softer than breath on skin. The sound seemed to rise from the earth itself, as if the great mounds were speaking in voices too deep for human ears. Following the strange sound toward the great mound's base, they found the entrance to the sacred burial chamber still sealed with its stone slab. But carved into the soft earth beside it were symbols none of them recognized. The markings looked fresh, as if etched by human hands in the recent past, yet they followed no pattern known to any of the surrounding peoples. Circles within circles, spirals that seemed to turn even when viewed steadily, and shapes that hurt the eyes to follow. The elder knelt beside the carvings, her ancient fingers tracing the air above them without quite touching the earth. "These are not the marks of any human hand," she said slowly. "The spirits who dwell beneath the mounds, they have been speaking. But their message, it speaks of endings that should not come for many lifetimes." The drumming grew stronger as they approached the sealed entrance, and now they could hear something else beneath it. Voices, faint as moth wings, seemed to call from deep within the earth. The sounds were not quite human, yet carried the cadence of human speech. It was as if the very stones were trying to remember the words of prayers spoken by the vanished people. The tracker pressed his ear to the stone slab sealing the burial chamber. "The voices come from below," he said, his own voice tight with fear. "But these chambers have been sealed since my grandfather's grandfather walked the earth. How can the dead speak when no living person remains to hear their words?" Using wooden poles as levers, they managed to shift the massive stone just enough to peer into the chamber beyond. The space within glowed with a pale light that seemed to come from the walls themselves, illuminating passages that stretched deeper into the earth than any of them had imagined. The burial chamber they had expected to find was merely the beginning of a vast underground network that honeycombed beneath the entire settlement. The walls bore paintings that moved in the strange light, showing scenes of the river people's daily life. But as they watched, the images began to change. Figures that had been tending crops suddenly looked up toward an empty sky with expressions of terror. Children who had been playing in the painted river began to point at something approaching from the western darkness. The very artwork seemed alive, telling the story of the settlement's final days. Following the painted corridors deeper into the earth, they discovered chambers filled with offerings unlike anything they had ever seen. Not the usual shells, copper, and sacred stones, but objects that seemed to have been shaped by hands that followed no human pattern. Twisted pieces of what might have been wood or bone, arranged in spirals that made their eyes water. Pottery vessels that seemed to change shape when viewed from different angles. In the deepest chamber, they found the answer to the settlement's mystery, carved into the walls in symbols that now blazed with that same pale light. The river people had not fled or been taken by enemies. They had received a summons from the spirits who dwelt in the deepest places of the earth, beings so ancient that they had ruled these lands before the first human footprint marked the riverbank. The wall carvings told of dreams that had visited every person in the settlement on the same night. Dreams of vast chambers beneath the earth where the old spirits waited for their children to return home. The underground dwellers had grown lonely in their deep places, and they called to the surface people with voices that could not be refused. One by one, the river people had answered the call, walking into passages that opened in the earth and closed behind them. The elder traced the glowing symbols with trembling fingers. "The old stories speak of such things," she whispered. "In the time before time, when the earth was young, the spirits below made a pact with the first people. They would share the surface for as long as the sun shone, but when the underground spirits grew too lonely, they could call their adopted children home." The final chamber held the most chilling revelation of all. Arranged in a perfect circle around a central fire pit that still glowed with cold light, they found personal belongings of the vanished people. Not just any belongings, but the most precious items each person owned. Medicine bundles, carved prayer sticks, children's favorite toys, and elders' sacred pipes. These objects had been placed with reverence, as if in preparation for a great journey. But carved above each pile of belongings was a name symbol, and beside each symbol was a date marker. The carvings showed that the calling had not happened all at once. For 7 full seasons, the underground spirits had been selecting individuals one by one, starting with the oldest and wisest. Children had watched their grandparents walk into the earth. Parents had seen their adult children answer calls that only they could hear. Until finally, on the night when the young woman first smelled wrongness in the air, the last remaining families had received their summons together. As they stood in that final chamber, surrounded by the belongings of the vanished people, the sound of drumming grew stronger. The painted walls around them began to shift and flow, showing new images, scenes of their own villages, their own families going about their daily tasks. But in the paintings, dark passages were opening in the earth near their homes, and shadowy figures were emerging to whisper in the ears of sleeping children. The youngest hunter pointed with a shaking hand at one of the paintings that had appeared on the wall nearest to him. It showed his own mother, sitting by her loom in their family lodge, but in the painting, she was setting down her weaving and turning toward a crack that had opened in the earth floor, a crack that glowed with the same pale light that surrounded them now. "They are not finished," the elder said, her voice heavy with the weight of terrible understanding. "The spirits below have tasted companionship after so many lifetimes of solitude. They will not be content with one settlement. They will call to others, and the calling will spread like wildfire across all the river valleys." The drumming reached a crescendo, and suddenly the walls around them began to move inward, not collapsing, but flowing like thick water, reshaping themselves into new passages that led deeper into the earth's heart. The belongings of the vanished people began to glow brighter, and in that cold light they could see faces appearing in the carved stone, the faces of the river people, calling to them wordlessly to join them in the deep places. Racing back through the narrowing passages, they emerged from the burial chamber as the sun reached its highest point. Behind them, they could hear the stone slab grinding back into place, sealing whatever lay beneath for any who might come after. The strange symbols carved in the earth around the mound's base were already fading, as if the very memory of what they had seen was being erased from the surface world. Yet, as they gathered their weapons and prepared to return to their own villages with this terrible news, they noticed that each of them cast 2 shadows on the ground. One shadow fell naturally from their bodies toward the north, but the second shadow stretched downward, as if part of them was already being pulled toward the earth. The underground spirits had marked them as witnesses, and perhaps as future companions. The journey home took twice as long as their arrival, for they found themselves stopping frequently to listen to sounds that seemed to come from beneath their feet. Each night, their dreams were filled with voices calling their names, and they woke to find small holes in the earth around their sleeping places, holes that glowed faintly in the pre-dawn darkness. When they finally reached their own territories, they found that the calling had already begun. 3 elders from the trackers' village had vanished in the night, leaving only their medicine bundles arranged in perfect circles where their beds had been. Children in the youngest hunter's settlement had been heard talking to voices that came from the root cellars, voices that their parents could not hear. The young woman called for a gathering of all the village councils, hoping to warn them of what was coming. But as the leaders assembled under the autumn moon, she noticed that many of them carried bundles of their most precious belongings, as if they too had received dreams telling them to prepare for a great journey. The underground spirits were no longer content to wait for answers to their calling. Standing before the council fire, the elder spoke the words that would be remembered long after all of them were gone. "The earth spirits have awakened from their long sleep of loneliness. They remember the old agreements, the promises made when the world was young. We can fight against their calling, but the spirits are patient. They will wait 1 season, or 10 seasons, or 100, but eventually, all who walk above will join those who dwell below." The council meeting ended with no solutions and few words of comfort. Some villages decided to post guards around their settlements, watching for the telltale signs of earth passages opening in the night. Others began packing their most essential belongings, reasoning that if the calling was inevitable, they should at least be prepared. A few of the youngest warriors spoke of trying to find the entrance to the deep places and confronting the underground spirits directly, but the elder silenced them with a look that carried the weight of centuries. The vanishing spread like ripples on still water, moving outward from the great river valleys to the smaller streams, and finally to the seasonal camps in the high country. Always it followed the same pattern, dreams that called to the chosen ones, small holes that appeared in the earth overnight, and eventually the quiet disappearance of entire families who left their belongings arranged in careful circles. The remaining peoples learned to read the subtle warnings that preceded each calling. Children would wake speaking languages that no elder recognized. their small voices forming words that seemed to come from deep in their throats, as if something else was speaking through them. Women grinding corn would find spirals carved into their grinding stones overnight, patterns so perfectly formed that no human hand could have made them. Men returning from hunts would discover that their prey had been arranged in circles around cold fire pits, positioned with a reverence that suggested ritual rather than random chance. The traders who still traveled the river routes began reporting strange encounters along the waterways. They would make camp near familiar landmarks, only to wake and find that the landscape had subtly changed. Rock formations that had guided travelers for generations would be missing single stones, creating gaps that seemed to draw the eye downward toward the earth. Ancient trees that had served as direction markers would be found, with their roots partially exposed, as if something beneath the ground had been gently pulling at them during the night. Not all peoples accepted the inevitability of the calling with resignation. In the mountain territories, where the stone was harder and the earth spirit's influence seemed weaker, several groups began organizing active resistance against the underground dwellers. They developed techniques for detecting the early signs of passage formation, using these warnings to evacuate threatened areas before the calling could take hold. These mountain peoples experimented with protective rituals, combining elements from multiple spiritual traditions in hopes of creating barriers that the earth spirits could not cross. They would surround their settlements with circles of fire that burned continuously, fed by specially prepared woods and herbs. They posted guards who carried objects made from metals that came from the deepest mines, reasoning that materials drawn from the earth's heart might carry some power over its spiritual inhabitants. The most elaborate resistance effort involved the construction of elevated settlements, entire villages built in the canopies of the largest trees. The theory behind these aerial communities was that distance from the ground would weaken the earth spirit's ability to extend their calling upward. For several seasons, this strategy appeared successful, and the tree-dwelling peoples began to believe they had found a permanent solution. But the underground dwellers proved more adaptable than their opponents had anticipated. Instead of attempting to call to the tree villages directly, the earth spirits began targeting the roots of the trees themselves. Slowly, methodically, they would convince the ancient trees to lower their branches toward the ground, creating bridges that connected the aerial settlements to the earth below. Once these connections were established, the calling could flow upward through the living wood, reaching even those who had thought themselves safely beyond its influence. As the calling continued across multiple generations, the surviving peoples found themselves split between two fundamentally different worldviews. One group, which came to be known as the Waiters, believed that the earth spirit's summons was part of a natural cycle that all humans would eventually experience. They lived their lives in preparation for their own calling, focusing on spiritual development and the creation of meaningful objects that they could carry with them into the deep places. The Waiters established special schools where children learned the songs and stories that had emerged from the underground cities. They practiced meditation techniques designed to make the eventual calling feel less traumatic, and they maintained detailed records of every dream and vision that reached them from below. Their communities became centers of artistic and spiritual achievement, as people sought to perfect their skills before answering their summons to the deep places. The opposing group, known as the Fighters, rejected the calling entirely and dedicated their lives to finding ways to break the ancient pact between humans and the earth spirits. They studied the oldest stories and legends, searching for clues about how the original agreement had been made and whether it contained provisions for its own cancellation. They experimented with different types of spiritual protection and developed increasingly sophisticated methods for detecting and countering the underground dwellers' influence. According to the dreams that occasionally reached the surface world, the spirits below were creating vast settlements in the earth's heart, cities that mirrored the ones above but existed in permanent twilight. The vanished people were said to tend gardens that grew in soil, lit by the same pale glow that emanated from the stone walls. They raised animals that had never seen sunlight, creatures that had adapted to life in the perpetual dusk of the underground realm. Some dreams spoke of great ceremonies held in caverns so vast that their ceilings disappeared into darkness above. In these spaces, the vanished people would gather to perform rituals that honored both their new spirit companions and their abandoned relatives on the surface. The underground dwellers had learned human customs and found them pleasing, incorporating songs and dances into their own ancient practices. The most vivid dreams told of hybrid children being born in the deep places, offspring of unions between the vanished humans and the earth spirits themselves. These children possessed abilities that transcended the limitations of either parent species. They could see clearly in absolute darkness, communicate without words across vast distances, and shape the living rock with their thoughts. But they also carried human emotions and memories, creating a bridge between the worlds above and below. As more seasons passed, the calling evolved from individual summons to mass movements that affected entire regions. The earth spirits had learned patience over countless centuries, but they had also learned efficiency. Instead of gradually selecting individuals from each settlement, they began extending open invitations to whole communities, offering them the choice to join the underground realm together or face an uncertain future on the surface. Some settlements tried to resist by moving away from the rivers, thinking that distance from the water might break the connection to the underground spirits. But the calling followed them to their new camps, for the spirits below could reach anywhere that human feet had touched the earth. Others attempted to appease the spirits with increased offerings, filling the natural caves and sinkholes with precious gifts. But the underground dwellers wanted more than objects. They wanted companionship to ease their eternal loneliness. The most disturbing development was the appearance of partial callings that left communities broken and incomplete. The earth spirits would take the storytellers first, those who held the oldest memories and knew the most sacred songs. Then the craftspeople who created objects of beauty and meaning. Finally, they would call to the children, who showed the earliest signs of spiritual gifts, leaving behind only the most practical members of each community. Years passed, and the stories of the vanishing people became legends told around winter fires. New generations grew up hearing about the great settlement by the river where 10,000 people had simply walked into the earth one night, leaving behind only their monuments and mysteries. But even as the stories became legends, the calling continued, quieter now, but never ending. The surviving peoples found themselves living in a world where the boundary between surface and underground had become increasingly permeable. Dreams from below brought news of the vanished communities, describing their adaptation to life in the deep places and their growing integration with the ancient earth spirits. Some of these messages carried warnings about changes coming to the surface world, transformations that would make the current way of life impossible. Shamans who specialized in interpreting these underground visions began to notice patterns that suggested the earth spirits were working toward a specific goal. The calling was not random selection or simple loneliness. It was part of a larger plan to preserve human culture and knowledge through a period of great change that would soon sweep across the surface world. The young woman herself lived to see her 70th winter, longer than most who had witnessed the first vanishing. By this time, she had become the keeper of memories for all the scattered peoples, the one person who held the complete story of how the calling had begun and spread. Her wisdom was sought by leaders from settlements many days' travel apart, all seeking guidance about how to respond to the increasingly urgent messages from below. On the night when the northern lights danced brightest in the sky, the young woman experienced the most vivid underground vision of her life. In this dream, she found herself standing in a vast chamber where representatives from every group of vanished people had gathered. Her old friend the tracker approached her, his weathered hunter's face now bearing the same pale glow that emanated from the underground walls. "Sister," he said, using the term of respect they had shared since childhood, "you have carried our stories faithfully through all these seasons. But now you must understand the truth behind the calling. The earth spirits did not steal us from the surface world. They offered us sanctuary from something far worse that is coming. The dream showed her visions of the future surface world, a place where the familiar patterns of life had broken down completely. Rivers ran, poisoned, forests withered under strange new influences, and creatures unlike anything in the natural world roamed the empty settlements. The surface transformation would make the old ways of life impossible, but those who accepted the earth spirit's invitation would be preserved in the deep places until the time of restoration came. The spirits below saw what was approaching, the tracker explained as they watched the devastating visions. They knew that forces beyond our understanding would soon reshape the surface world. The calling was never about loneliness or conquest. It was about survival, about ensuring that human wisdom and culture would continue through the dark time ahead. But on the night when the northern lights danced brightest in the sky, she too heard the voices calling her name from beneath her sleeping furs. She rose quietly, gathered her medicine bundle and her grandmother's favorite grinding stone, and walked out into the snow. Her family found her tracks leading to a small hole in the frozen earth, a hole that glowed softly until dawn and then sealed itself as if it had never been. In the generations that followed, the great mounds of the river people became places of both reverence and fear. Travelers would leave offerings at their bases but never linger after sunset. The earthen monuments stood as reminders of the ancient agreement between the surface dwellers and those who ruled the deep places, a pact that had evolved from simple coexistence to active preservation of human culture through times of great change. Sometimes, when the seasons turned and the earth grew restless, new holes would appear near settlements throughout the land. Elders who knew the old stories would warn their people to watch for the signs: dreams of glowing passages, shadows that fell downward instead of across the ground, and the sound of distant drumming that seemed to come from the heart of the world itself. And in the deepest caves and the most hidden valleys, where the earth spirits waited in their eternal loneliness, the vanished people lived on in ways that surface dwellers could barely imagine. They tended gardens that grew in the pale light that emanated from the stone walls. They raised children who had never seen the sun but who knew the songs of the deep places. And sometimes, on nights when the boundaries between the upper and lower worlds grew thin, they would send dreams to their distant relatives above, dreams that whispered of the peace that waited for all people when their time to answer the calling finally came. The mounds still stand in the river valley, weathered by countless seasons but enduring as monuments to the people who built them. And beneath them, the passages still wind through the earth's heart, occasionally glowing with that strange pale light when the underground spirits remember their loneliness and reach out once again to touch the world above. For the ancient pact remains unbroken, and the calling continues, as patient and inevitable as the turning of the seasons themselves. In the end, the story of the vanishing mounds serves as a reminder that humans share this world with forces far older and more mysterious than they can fully understand. The monuments left by the river people stand not as markers of their disappearance, but as testament to their choice to honor agreements made in the world's youth, even when honoring them meant leaving the sunlit world forever. And sometimes, when travelers pass the ancient mounds at dawn or dusk, they report hearing faint sounds drifting up from the earth: laughter of children, songs of celebration, and the rhythmic drumming that speaks of life continuing in the deep places where the first spirits still dwell, no longer lonely now that they have their chosen people to keep them company in the endless chambers beneath the world.